Snow didn't just fall. It erased them. Entire German divisions vanished without a trace, not from gunfire, but from a cold so brutal it shattered men where they stood. Rifles froze solid, skin cracked open. Bodies were found days later, still standing locked in ice like statues. They were told to hold the line. They were never told they would be abandoned to die. What happened in that winter wasn't a battle. It was a slow execution. And behind the frozen silence lies a truth far darker than history ever admitted. The invasion began like a storm that no one believed could be stopped. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a campaign so massive it stretched across thousands of miles and pulled millions of men into a single, relentless advance. Entire Soviet defenses collapsed in weeks. Cities fell one after another. Columns of tanks carved through the land with terrifying speed, and for a moment, it looked as if nothing could slow them down. Victory didn't feel possible. It felt inevitable. Orders moved quickly, plans tightened, and the belief that the war would end before winter settled into every rank like fact, not hope. No one prepared for what came after. The entire strategy depended on speed. Supply lines were built to keep up with movement, not to endure distance. Fuel, ammunition, and rations flowed forward as long as the advance never stopped. But with every mile gained, the line stretched thinner, more fragile, more exposed. Roads turned to dust, then to mud, swallowing trucks and delaying reinforcements. Mechanical failures began quietly, then spread. Engines overheated, parts wore down, and repairs took longer than expected. Still, the push continued. There was no pause, no recalculation, only momentum driven by confidence and command. What no one accounted for was time. Weeks turned into months. Resistance, though shattered, never fully disappeared. Small pockets of Soviet forces regrouped, striking supply routes and slowing progress in ways that didn't show on maps, but were felt in every delay. The front moved forward, but the strain underneath it grew heavier with each passing day. The idea of a quick victory started to slip, though few dared to say it. Because admitting it meant admitting something far worse, that they were deeper than planned, farther than expected, and dangerously unprepared for what was coming next. And as the advance dragged on, the first cold winds began to move across the open land, unnoticed at first, but impossible to stop. At first, it didn't feel like a threat. The cold arrived quietly, slipping into the cracks of an already exhausted army. Mornings grew sharper. Breath lingered longer in the air. Frost formed on rifles, then melted by noon. It felt temporary, just another obstacle that would pass. But beneath that calm surface, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Temperatures dropped faster than a cold that doesn't just touch the body, but invades it. Temperatures plunged past anything the men had ever experienced, dropping to levels where survival itself became uncertain. At -40 degrees, the air no longer felt like air. It burned with every breath, cutting through lungs like shards of glass. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Ears turned white. Fingers stiffened, then stopped responding entirely. Movement slowed, not from exhaustion, but because the body itself began to shut down. The land transformed into something unrecognizable. Snow didn't fall gently, it buried everything. Roads vanished beneath thick layers of ice. Tracks disappeared overnight. Landmarks that once guided entire divisions were swallowed whole, leaving men disoriented in endless white silence. Even sound changed. Gunfire echoed strangely, muted by the heavy air, while footsteps crunched like breaking bone. The battlefield was no longer a place, it was a void. Weapons became useless burdens, metal contracted in the freezing air, jamming internal mechanisms beyond repair. Rifle bolts locked in place, machine guns froze mid-burst, their barrels stiff and lifeless. Ammunition misfired or failed entirely. Soldiers tried everything, breathing onto metal, wrapping parts in cloth, keeping weapons pressed against their bodies, but nothing held for long. The cold always returned, stronger, more absolute. Fighting became less about the enemy and more about staying alive. Bodies began to fail just as quickly. Frostbite spread with terrifying speed, turning skin black and brittle. Some men didn't even realize it was happening until it was too late. Others felt the pain, a deep, crushing ache that slowly faded into numbness, followed by something worse. Nothing at all. Limbs became useless weight. Faces hardened into expressionless masks. And when exhaustion finally set in, many made the same fatal mistake. They stopped moving. Some sat down just for a moment, trying to rest. Others leaned against vehicles or collapsed beside the road. Within minutes, their bodies cooled, their breathing slowed, and sleep took over. It felt peaceful, quiet, almost comforting. But it wasn't sleep, it was the final stage. And when morning came, they were still there, frozen exactly where they had fallen, as if time itself had stopped around them. The moment the cold reached its peak, the silence broke, and from it came something the Germans had not prepared for. Under the command of Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army struck back with a force shaped by the very winter that was killing their enemy. Reinforcements poured in from the east, Siberian units trained to fight in temperatures that shattered unprepared armies. Clothed in white camouflage, moving across snow with precision, they didn't just survive the cold, they used it. The counteroffensive began suddenly, hitting weakened positions that had already been pushed to the edge. German units, slowed by frozen equipment and collapsing supply lines, struggled to respond. Tanks that once led the charge now sat immobile, engines dead beneath layers of ice. Artillery pieces were abandoned where they stood, too heavy to move and too cold to operate. Communication lines faltered, radios failing in the freezing air, leaving entire units isolated without orders or support. What had once been a coordinated advance was now breaking into scattered pockets of confusion. The Soviets moved fast, cutting through exposed flanks and surrounding entire formations before they could react. Encirclements formed rapidly, trapping thousands in shrinking zones where escape became nearly impossible. Every attempt to regroup was met with relentless pressure. The snow that blinded and buried German soldiers became cover for advancing Soviet forces, who struck with sudden bursts of violence before vanishing again into the white. It wasn't just a counterattack. It was a calculated dismantling of an army already collapsing from within. For the Germans, the realization came too late. This was no longer a fight they could control. Every step backward risked isolation. Every delay meant being surrounded. The battlefield had shifted entirely, turning their own advance routes into corridors of retreat that were quickly being cut off. Men who had marched forward with certainty were now looking over their shoulders, searching for a way out that no longer existed. And as the pressure closed in, as entire divisions began to disappear behind enemy lines, the command came down from above, clear, absolute, and impossible to survive. There would be no retreat. The order came down with absolute clarity, leaving no room for it to abandon when engines refused to start. Rations dwindled quickly. Meals were stretched, then halved, then gone. Ammunition was counted with care, every bullet saved for a moment that might never come. The army that had once advanced with overwhelming force was now trapped in place, starving, freezing, and running out of everything that kept it alive. And slowly, the realization spread through the ranks, not as panic, but as a quiet, crushing truth. They weren't being reinforced, they weren't being rescued. They had been left there to endure something no one was meant to survive. Hunger came next, and it didn't arrive slowly, it hit like a collapse from within. With supply lines gone and rations reduced to almost nothing, the men were forced into a fight their training had never prepared them for. Stomachs twisted in constant pain, energy drained faster than it could be replaced. What little food remained was rationed down to fragments. thin scraps that barely kept a man standing, let alone fighting. And when those scraps ran out, desperation took over. They began to eat whatever they could find. Frozen horse carcasses became a source of survival, hacked apart with dull blades that barely cut through ice-hardened flesh. Leather straps were boiled down in an attempt to extract something, anything, from them. Some chewed on frozen bread so hard it cracked their teeth. Others searched abandoned packs, hoping to find a forgotten ration or a piece of anything that could be swallowed. But the cold consumed even that. Food froze solid within minutes, turning nourishment into something that required effort just to bite. The body began to break under the strain. Weakness spread through entire units. Men who once marched for miles now struggled to stand. Simple tasks became exhausting. Carrying equipment, digging positions, even lifting a rifle demanded energy that no longer existed. And as physical strength faded, something deeper started to fracture: the mind. Isolation, hunger, and cold combined into something far more dangerous than any weapon. Conversations grew shorter. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others muttered to themselves, repeating words that made no sense. Hallucinations were reported. Visions of warmth, of home, of food that wasn't there. A few wandered away from their positions in search of relief that didn't exist, disappearing into the snow without a trace. Discipline, once held together by structure and command, began to dissolve into pure instinct. Units that had once operated as one started to fragment. Orders were ignored, not out of defiance, but because the strength to follow them was gone. Survival became individual, every man for himself, even while standing side by side. Trust faded. Hope followed. And then, one by one, they began to stop moving. Not from wounds, not from battle, but because their bodies no longer had anything left to give. They would sit down just for a moment and never stand up again. It didn't happen all at once. Entire divisions didn't fall in battle. They disappeared in silence. Positions that once held hundreds grew quiet, then empty, without a single shot fired. Patrols sent to check on neighboring units returned with nothing but fragments of what had been left behind. Rifles stood propped against frozen walls, helmets half buried in snow, footprints leading nowhere. It was as if the men themselves had been erased, swallowed by something that left no trace except absence. When bodies were found, they didn't look like casualties of war. They looked preserved, perfectly still. Some were discovered sitting upright, backs against trees or vehicles, eyes half closed as if sleep had taken them gently. Others were found lying beside one another, clustered together in a final attempt to share warmth that never came. Hands were frozen mid-motion, faces locked in expressions that revealed nothing. No fear, no pain, just silence. The cold had taken everything, even the last moments. Reports began to describe entire zones where survival was nearly impossible. Areas where units entered with full strength and vanished within days. Casualty numbers climbed beyond comprehension, not from combat losses, but from exposures so severe it wiped out nearly everyone it touched. In some formations, over 90% were gone. Lost not in a single battle, but over time, piece by piece, until nothing remained. The lines on the map still existed, but the men assigned to hold them did not. Attempts to recover the dead became almost impossible. The ground was too hard to dig. Shovels struck frozen earth and bounced back uselessly. There were no graves, no markers, none complete, as if the mind itself refused to process what had happened. A few accounts described moments that stayed locked in place, impossible to forget. The sound of frozen boots scraping across ice, the sight of men trying to light fires with hands that could no longer feel, the feeling of falling asleep knowing it meant not waking up. Some spoke of watching others give in, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion so deep it erased the will to resist. There were no final words, no dramatic endings, just a slow, fading into stillness. Official reports tried to compress it into numbers, casualty lists, loss percentages, equipment failures. But those documents never captured the reality of what the survivors carried back with them, because the damage wasn't limited to the body. It stayed in the mind, repeating in flashes, in dreams, in moments of silence that stretched too long. Many never returned to normal life. Some couldn't. Others chose not to speak at all, burying everything beneath years of distance that never truly worked. And behind every account, every scar, every unfinished sentence, there was one detail that remained constant. This wasn't just a defeat. It was something far worse. Something that had been allowed to happen. And the truth behind it was still waiting to be uncovered. The numbers never told the full story. Reports reduced everything to percentages, losses, and failed objectives. But what happened in that winter went far beyond statistics. In some sectors, over 90% of the men sent forward never came back. Not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were left in conditions no army could survive. Exposure, starvation, and command decisions combined into something far more destructive than any opposing force. It wasn't a single mistake. It was a chain of them, each one tightening the grip until there was no escape. The belief that the campaign would end quickly became the foundation of the disaster. Preparation was sacrificed for speed. Winter gear was delayed. Supply systems were stretched beyond their limits, and when the moment came to adapt, to pull back, to preserve what remained, the order never came. The line had to be held even when there was nothing left to hold it with. The belief that the campaign would end quickly became the foundation of the disaster. Preparation was sacrificed for speed. Winter gear was delayed. Supply systems were stretched beyond their limits. And when the moment came to adapt, to pull back, to preserve what remained, the order never came. The line had to be held even when there was nothing left to hold it with. Entire divisions disappeared not in a single moment, but over time, fading into the cold until only fragments remained. No final stand, no clear end. Just a slow collapse that left behind frozen ground and empty positions where men had once stood. What happened there wasn't just a military failure. It was a lesson written in ice. One that showed how quickly strength can turn into silence when nature is ignored and men are pushed beyond the point of survival. And in that silence, the truth remains. Some battles are lost long before they begin.